8 records, 1 night, 1 loss. And somewhere in that contradiction is the most honest story of what the 2026 Indiana Fever actually are right now. Not what the highlights suggest, not what the celebration posts are selling, but what the film and the numbers and the context are telling anyone willing to look at all three at the same time. 298 days. That number is where this story starts, because without understanding what those 298 days actually meant, not just physically, but psychologically, institutionally, and competitively, you cannot fully understand why what happened on opening night carries the weight that it does. This is not a highlight recap. Your feed is already buried in those. What you're going to get here is the complete picture. The 8 records placed against the full backdrop of this league's history, the institutional stakes that most coverage glossed over entirely, and the uncomfortable question that nobody in the celebration narrative wanted to ask out loud, the one that Indiana's coaching staff cannot afford to ignore even for a single week if this season is going to go where this roster is capable of taking it. Because those two stories, the historic night and the loss, are not separate conversations. They are the same conversation. And if you have been waiting for someone to have it honestly, you are in the right place. Let's start with 298 days, because that number is not just a recovery timeline. For someone wired the way Caitlin Clark is wired, someone who has described basketball not simply as her profession, but the core of her competitive identity, 298 days on the sideline is a specific kind of psychological endurance test that has no clean parallel in the normal experience of being a professional athlete. She was in the building every night. She was vocal about supporting her teammates. She cheered, she engaged, she did everything a good teammate does when the body is unavailable, but the mind is fully present. But she also gave reporters one line during that stretch that strips away every diplomatic framing about how that period actually felt on the inside. "I was excited for my teammates, 100%. I was their biggest fan, but it's not the same. It just isn't." That is not bitterness talking. That is not frustration leaking through a carefully managed public image. That is an elite competitor being precise about a real experience, acknowledging the gap between being present for something and being part of it, between watching a game and being inside one. And what it tells you, if you are paying attention, is that the hunger that had been building since July of 2025 was not the kind that fades with time. It was the kind that compounds with every game she watched from a seat instead of a floor. The recovery itself was methodical. The medical staff was careful. The timeline was managed with the kind of deliberate patience that a franchise-defining player demands and deserves. And when she finally returned to live competitive basketball in March of 2026, the stage was the FIBA qualifying tournament in Puerto Rico, a setting with genuine stakes, real competition, real consequences. She did not ease back in, she dominated. Tournament MVP honors, questions about her recovery answered in the most direct language possible, performance. But Clark herself was precise about separating that experience from what opening night in Indianapolis actually represents. Playing for the Fever in front of the home crowd gives you a different juice inside your body. Read that carefully, because it is not a colorful quote designed for social media engagement. It is a precise description of a real competitive variable, the kind that cannot be manufactured in a qualifier in Puerto Rico, cannot be replicated in preseason, cannot be simulated in any context that does not involve the exact combination of that building, those fans, that uniform, and meaningful regular season stakes. Puerto Rico told her the body was ready. Opening night told her something else entirely, and she knew the difference before the ball was ever tipped. Here is what most coverage of Clark's return spent almost no time on, and it is arguably the most important contextual layer of the entire story. The stakes on opening night were not just personal. They were not even just about the Indiana Fever as a franchise. They were institutional in a way that extends to every team in the league, every front office, every broadcast partner, and every sponsor that has made a financial commitment based on what the WNBA has become over the last 2 years. The NBC broadcast deal that repositioned women's basketball as prime-time programming in this country. The deal responsible for doubling viewership figures, generating sponsor interest at levels this league had never previously seen, and introducing millions of casual sports fans to the WNBA as a product worth their attention and their time. That deal is built on a specific underlying assumption. That assumption is Caitlin Clark playing basketball. Every game she missed during those 298 days was not simply a loss for Indiana in the standings. It was a structural revenue event with ripple effects across franchise valuations, broadcast ratings, and the ongoing negotiation landscape for the media deal that follows this one. Front offices from Seattle to Connecticut were tracking her injury updates with the same quiet anxiety as Fever season ticket holders, because her return to the floor is not good news for one team. It is a structural support beam for the entire league's current growth cycle. So when she walked into Gainbridge Fieldhouse on opening night, she was not simply carrying a comeback narrative. She was carrying the weight of an institution that had been waiting 298 days for one specific player to be back on one specific floor. Pre-game, observers at shoot-around noticed something the broadcast cameras did not make a centerpiece. Her hands were not entirely steady. She had told reporters she was way more excited than nervous, and she meant it, but her body was communicating something more layered than any single description could hold. And she acknowledged it afterward in a way that reframes the moment entirely. She said she had missed the butterflies, that feeling means you are ready. When someone who has hit game winners in front of packed arenas, who has performed on the largest stages this sport offers, who has been the most scrutinized player in this league since the day she was drafted, when that person tells you she was nervous, you do not file it under routine pre-game energy. You pay attention to what it reveals about the actual weight of the moment she was walking into. The early game belonged to Dallas. Indiana did not find its footing quickly, and the first half carried the rough edges that every honest observer expected from a team returning its cornerstone player after a 10-month absence and working through the early season chemistry questions that no amount of preseason preparation fully resolves. But what kept Indiana from falling out of the game entirely in that first half was not Clark gradually rediscovering her rhythm. It was Kelsey Mitchell deciding from the opening tip that she was not going to wait for the night to come to her. Mitchell was aggressive, precise, and relentless. She attacked closeouts. She found pull-up opportunities in traffic. She made Dallas pay for every moment their attention shifted toward the returning star on the perimeter. By the time the final buzzer sounded, Mitchell had posted 30 points on the Dallas defense, and that number is not simply a strong individual performance in a high-profile game. It broke the Indiana Fever franchise record for most points scored by any player in a season opener, a record that had stood untouched for years, taken down on a night when Mitchell's entire role was supposed to be supporting the story happening around her. Instead, she wrote her own chapter, and it was one of the most important chapters of the night. Aliyah Boston was operating in a completely different register, and the numbers she put up deserve more attention than the post-game coverage gave them. Playing only 26 minutes, she finished with 23 points while simultaneously creating transition mismatches that Dallas simply had no consistent answer for. The efficiency was striking. The impact on the game's pace was real. Analysts were placing her name in all WNBA conversations before the league was 48 hours into its new season,
And based on what that stat line actually represents, 23 points in 26 minutes, while generating problems in transition against a prepared defensive unit, those conversations were not premature. They were responding to documented evidence that opposing coaching staffs will be rewatching film the following morning, trying to find answers to. Then there was the performance that most coverage buried entirely under the headline numbers, and it deserves to be pulled out and examined on its own terms. Sophomore Michaela Timpson went 5 for 6 from the field for 11 points in 19 minutes off the bench. With Monique Billings unavailable, Indiana needed someone from the second unit to step into a pressure situation and prevent the depth question from becoming a scoreboard problem. Timpson answered that challenge in the most demanding environment of her young professional career, a packed Gainbridge Fieldhouse, Clark's return game, a nationally watched broadcast, and she did not blink. That composure doesn't come from film sessions or practice repetitions alone. It comes from feel, from the kind of instinctive spatial awareness that either exists in a player or does not.
Midway through the contest, Clark made 2 trips to the tunnel, and the collective anxiety that spiked instantly across social media was completely understandable. The groin was the first thing every watching fan thought of. Coach Stephanie White addressed it directly in her post-game availability. Routine back adjustments, managing the physical demands of returning to full game speed after a long absence. Clark herself was brief about it, just getting her back put back in. The relief that spread across the Fever fan base in the moments after that clarification was almost audible. She finished the game with 20 points, 7 assists, and 5 rebounds, 7 of 18 from the field, 2 of 9 from 3, 5 turnovers, 3 of which came as offensive fouls that converted directly into live ball Dallas transition opportunities. That is not a perfect performance, but it is an honest one. And understanding the difference between those two things is going to define how this entire season gets written. Before we get into what 8 records in a single game actually means at the historical level, and why record number 4 is the one that quietly reshapes the all-time conversation about this player's place in this sport, let's make sure the foundation is laid correctly. Because the way most outlets are presenting these milestones does not give you the full picture of what they represent against the entire backdrop of this league's history. Records 1 and 2 belong to the 1,000-point milestone, and they need to be read together to understand their combined significance. Clark became the fastest point guard in WNBA history to reach 1,000 career points, accomplishing it in 54 games. That alone would be a notable entry in the record books. But the second record sitting alongside it changes the entire framing. She also reached that threshold faster than all but 5 players in the league's history, across every position ever played at this level, in every era this sport has existed. She is not simply rewriting the point guard record book. She is sitting in a tier with the most prolific scorers this sport has ever produced, regardless of where they stood on the floor, regardless of what defensive rules or game conditions surrounded them. Record 3 is where the historical significance sharpens into something genuinely rare and worth stopping on. Reaching 1,000 career points is impressive on its own. Most players who come through this league never get there. But reaching 1,000 career points while simultaneously accumulating 250 career rebounds and 250 career assists requires a level of multidimensional production that almost no guard in this league's history has ever approached. You can be a scorer, you can be a playmaker, you can be a rebounder for your position. Doing all 3 at the rate required to hit all 3 thresholds in 54 games is a different category of player entirely. Clark reached all 3 in 54 games, and in doing so, she broke a record held by Diana Taurasi, who needed 62 games to reach that same combination. 8 fewer games, against a player who is placed by most serious analysts among the greatest to have ever competed at this level, in any era, at any position.
The comparison is not rhetoric, it is a documented statistical fact sitting in the official league record books, available for anyone to look up and verify. Record 4 is the one that ages best across the arc of a long career, and it is the record that most coverage is treating as a footnote when it deserves to be the headline. Clark now holds the record for the most 20-point, 5-rebound, 5-assist games in the entire WNBA history. Not in her age group, not among guards, not among players from her draft class, across the whole league at every position since this sport began. And she has accumulated those performances at a pace in fewer games than anyone else who has ever played. That statistic is not measuring a single explosive night that got away from the opposing defense. It is measuring sustained, repeatable, multidimensional dominance across a sample of games large enough to be meaningful, the kind of consistency that separates historically significant players from players who simply had a remarkable stretch. Records 5 through 8 belong to the team, and they deserve their own framing separate from the individual milestones.
Mitchell's 30 points established a new franchise record for the season opener, as mentioned. But Clark, Mitchell, and Boston all scoring 20 or more in the same game made Indiana only the third team in WNBA history to have 3 players crack 20 points in a season opener, and the first time that had ever happened in Fever franchise history specifically. Indiana set a franchise high for total points in a season opener, and both teams together made history as the first opening night matchup in league history where both sides broke triple digits, finishing 107 to 104. That last record is worth sitting with for a moment, because what it tells you about the Dallas Wings is important. The Wings ran their offensive system with genuine precision. They were prepared. Their role players were engaged and purposeful. Paige Bakers was composed and efficient and clearly ready for the rivalry that the league has been building promotional narrative around for over a year. She and Clark sharing a floor in a game that set a league-wide offensive record for opening night suggests that this matchup has a real future that extends well beyond the marketing packaging surrounding it. The competition level was authentic on both sides. Remember that, because it matters for everything that comes next. Now, here is the part of this conversation that does not belong in the celebration narrative, but that cannot be separated from it if you are going to be honest about where this team actually stands. You can acknowledge 8 records falling in a single night. You can hold space for what that means historically, and you can still ask the question that demands a real answer. How does a team with 3 players combining for 73 points lose the game? The answer is sitting in Dallas's shooting percentages, and anyone willing to look at the numbers clearly can see it without any additional analysis required. 59% from the field, 52% from 3, 12 three-pointers on 23 attempts. Those are not hot shooting flukes. Those are not numbers that appear when a defense is simply having a bad night and the ball happens to fall for the other team. Those are numbers that show up when a defense is exposing the same structural gaps repeatedly, possession after possession, quarter after quarter, without meaningful adjustment in coverage assignments or rotation timing. Dallas found the open man every time Indiana's rotation arrived late, and Indiana's rotation was consistently late, not in one difficult stretch, not in one quarter where the opponent got hot and made everything look broken, as a persistent, recurring pattern across 40 minutes of basketball against a team that came into the game with a specific plan and executed it with discipline. Monique Billings being unavailable carries significantly more structural weight here than most post-game coverage acknowledged. Billings provides defensive rebounding and interior presence that fundamentally changes the geometry of Indiana's defensive shell. Without that anchor, every coverage assignment carries more individual risk. Every help rotation has a thinner margin for timing error. Every closeout on the perimeter has less interior support behind it.
Dallas understood this before tip-off, and their role players, Odyssey Sims, Jessica Shepard, and Alana Smith, all contributed the kind of ball movement that prevented Indiana from loading its defensive attention on any single threat. The Wings kept moving, they kept finding the open man, they kept Indiana's defense guessing all night, especially alongside a primary scorer in Bakers who does not need to force anything when her teammates are generating clean looks by moving the ball with purpose. This is the kind of detail that decides playoff series, not in November, in May and June, when defensive execution gets tested by teams with the film preparation to exploit every pattern they identified in the regular season. White addressed it directly in her post-game availability, and her message was unambiguous. Indiana cannot build a championship identity around trying to outscore every opponent. The offensive ceiling on this roster is genuinely historic. 3 players combining for 73 points on opening night is documented proof of that. But talent on one end of the floor does not automatically translate to execution on the other end. Those are 2 separate disciplines. And the results from Game 1 made the gap between Indiana's offensive capability and their defensive execution in the most public way possible. A final score on a nationally watched broadcast. Consider the specific Clark contribution to the turnover problem, because it is a correctable issue, but only if it is treated as one that requires deliberate attention rather than assuming it resolves itself with more playing time.
5 turnovers on opening night. 3 of them came as offensive fouls that converted directly into live ball Dallas transition opportunities. In those 3 possessions, Indiana did not simply fail to score. They handed Dallas the ball in space with momentum already generated, creating the exact transition conditions that a defense without its interior anchor is least equipped to contain. That is not a minor footnote in the turnover column. Those 3 possessions represent a compounding problem, turnovers that cost Indiana both the points they would have scored and the points Dallas scored on the other end. The offensive fouls are a correctable pattern, but correction requires deliberate adjustment in how she reads defensive traffic in the paint, particularly when the opposing defense is anticipating the drive and setting up for the charge before she gets there. Dallas's preparation was visible enough on film that they may look to generate that exact situation again in any potential rematch. The tendency needs to be addressed before it becomes a documented vulnerability that every team in the league's film room is drawing up plays to exploit. The deeper structural issue, though, is about defensive chemistry under pressure, and it is the challenge that cannot be shortcutted by any amount of talent, preparation, or individual commitment. Clark, Boston, and Mitchell are each individually capable of dominating on any given night. Opening night proved that beyond any reasonable argument. But building defensive chemistry, the real kind, not the kind that looks functional in walkthroughs, requires something that cannot be purchased or installed. You switch pick-and-roll assignments on instinct when you have played enough games together to trust your read of the moment. You communicate when a cutter slips through the help rotation before it becomes a basket, because you have seen that cut happen before and your body knows what the coverage demands. You trust the person behind you to be exactly where the scheme requires because you have watched them make that rotation under real pressure in real games. That chemistry only develops through actual games with actual consequences and actual read and react decisions happening at full speed. The opener was always going to carry rough edges for this exact reason. White knows it. The veteran players know it. The question the league is now watching with genuine interest is how quickly those edges close before Indiana faces a team with offensive discipline that matches or exceeds what Dallas brought on opening night. Here is the forward-looking angle that gives you the full stakes of what this season actually represents. Clark is 54 games into her NBA career. She is already past Diana Taurasi's milestone markers. The conversation about where she ultimately sits in the all-time canon of this sport is no longer a projection based on potential or a debate based on early career performance. It is an active, ongoing documentation happening in real time, with entries being added to the official record books at a rate that is making historical analysts pay attention in a way they typically reserve for careers measured in decades rather than seasons. The question for the 2026 Indiana Fever is not whether Clark belongs in the all-time conversation. That question closed on opening night. The question now, the only question that carries weight going forward, is whether this team can build enough defensive identity fast enough and deep enough to give her what no individual stat line, no record broken, and no milestone reached can deliver on its own. I told CC I'd be on a rocket and roll with her for as long as she wants to do this. I think the chemistry is there. The belief inside that locker room is genuine. You can hear it in the way they talk about each other. The offensive talent is documented, and it is historic. 8 records fell in one night on that floor, and Dallas still walked out of Gainbridge Fieldhouse with the win. That is the real story of the 2026 Indiana Fever. Not the records, not the loss, but the distance between what this team is capable of and what they have actually built so far. 40 minutes into a 40-game regular season that leads somewhere genuinely transformative or deeply frustrating, depending entirely on one question. Can the defense catch up to the offense before the margin for error disappears? That question does not have an answer yet, but every game from here forward is writing one. And if you want to be here when the picture becomes clear, when the answer stops being a question and starts being a result, you know what to do. We'll see you for the next chapter.